After the discovery of the Zimmerman note, and that's pretty much the end of, well, the beginning of us really wanting to go to war with um, Germany. But at the same time, across the world, the Russian monarchy actually collapses and is taken over um, during the Bolshevik Revolution. And so they set up a communist state, and that government withdraws the Russian army from the Eastern Front and then signs a peace agreement with the Central Powers. And so now that Russia is out of the conflict, Germany's free to fight in the West. And it looked like they really had a chance at winning the war. So with the end of the Russian monarchy, it's replaced by this representative government, and this kind of brings the US more likely to get involved, because now all of the allies have this this democratic government. And so in April of 1917, Congress is going to gather and pass a resolution to declare war on Germany and the Central Powers, and we are officially headed off to war. And that brings us to lesson 2. The U.S. mobilizes a large army and navy to help the Allies achieve victory. And what is unfortunate is that initially when we declare war, we really don't have enough people. We only have about 200,000 men in the service when war is declared. So we need to raise an army very quickly. And that brings us to the Selective Service Act. And so this requires men to register with the Army, and they were going to be randomly selected for military service. So by the end of 1918, you have about 24 million registering under this act. And then 3 million of those men are going to be called up, and then 2 million troops will be sent to Europe before the truce is actually signed to end World War I. 3/4 of them actually saw combat. And a lot of these people had never even attended high school, and about 1 in 5 are foreign born. They go through about an 8-month training, and we really don't even have enough weapons to practice our drills and things. So a lot of times they're training with fake weapons. They're using rocks instead of hand grenades, or wooden poles instead of rifles. So it's kind of crazy. Women aren't really they're not allowed in combat positions at this point in time. They serve as nurses, secretaries, and phone operators, and that's pretty much the extent of it. On the home front, in order to get ready for the war, we had to expand our fleet to transport all the men, the food, and the equipment that we needed in Europe. But with the U-boats attacking all these merchant ships in the Atlantic, there's a serious threat to that effort, that Allied war effort. And by 1917, German submarines are sinking twice as much ship tonnage as the Allies had built. So the U.S. government's going to take several steps to expand on its fleet. They're going to exempt shipyard workers from the draft. It gave them what we call a deferred status. And they were, sent to the shipyards instead of into war. And they're going to use prefabrication techniques, so they're going to assemble little pieces of the ship in different places and then ship all of those pieces into one place and then put them together. And it's much faster to do that. We're also going to, we being the U.S. government, is going to take over commercial and private ships so that we can get this bigger and bigger Navy as quickly as possible. And after 2.5 years of fighting, the Allied forces are pretty exhausted. They're demoralized, and they're pretty desperate for help. So the Americans are able to provide fresh troops, people with better attitudes, and they haven't been sitting in trenches for years, so they don't have that depressed mentality just yet. So they're going to bring a new attitude over to Europe. But we had to turn the tide with the German U-boat situation first. So even though we have all of these new ships, we're still easy targets for all of these U-boats. And we needed to figure out a way to protect everything that was making that transatlantic trip. And the American Vice Admiral William S. Sims is going to convince the British to try the convoy system. And it's actually a method to help guard a group of ships. So you put your destroyers out front, and they're going to escort the merchant ships back and forth across the Atlantic. So by the fall of 1917, shipping losses had been greatly cut, almost really in half. And if you look at a convoy system, it almost looks like what you would call, like you see geese flying in like a V shape. So you have your defensive boundaries out front, and almost like in a V shape. It's not exactly like that, but kind of like that. And then your merchant ships follow safely behind them. And this is actually really effective. By 1918, Germans have difficulty replacing their boats and their trained submariners. And so the U.S. Navy is going to help lay a 230-mile barrier of mines across the North Sea from Scotland to Norway. And this was meant to bottle up those U-boats and keep them out of the Atlantic. So after 2.5 years of fighting, the Allied forces are exhausted, demoralized, and we're going to bring that freshness. The first troops to arrive in France in the late June of 1917. They are American soldiers who went overseas to form the American Expeditionary Force, and they're led by General John J. Pershing. They included soldiers from the regular Army, National Guard, and a larger force of volunteers and draftees. And they're pretty much from all over the country. So these infantrymen, their nickname is Doughboys. And they got that name because they wore these belts that, they cleaned with pipe clay or dough. And yeah, that's what they're called, Doughboys. So with the next video, we'll talk about all of the new weapons and kind of how we're fighting World War I, kind of go into more depth with that. And we'll actually wrap up the war as far as like historical timeline goes, but then we still have to talk about what happens at home too.